With Philadelphia's artisans feeling exploited by their colonial masters in London, they count on their longtime ally, Benjamin Franklin, to defend them from tyranny. But Franklin has other plans.
Franklin fully expects that the British Empire is going to become Philadelphia-centered. He envisions Parliament meeting in Philadelphia. He envisions the Tower of London being moved to a tower in Philadelphia.
He appears in his earliest portrait in all the appropriate clothing of an English gentleman with a wig.
Franklin in 1765 is an elite. He's one of the wealthiest men in America.
Philadelphia has no kings and queens, but it has its own royalty.
The commercial elite forms a tight ruling class. The Willings, the Powells, the Shippens, the Logans, the Whartons, they all develop a fortune.
The cultural elite do not want to be thought of as the country cousins from 3,000 miles away. They wanted to be just as English as anyone living in the British Isles.
Dressed in the clothing of the London elite, they fill their houses with the most exquisite furniture and decoration, supplied by Philadelphia's craft artisans.
There was a terrific pool of artisans. The elite class could pick and choose among those craftsmen to get the kinds of goods that they wanted.
The upholsterer's apprentice, Betsy Griscom, learns that her future hinges on the demands of the upper class.
Who's buying upholstered furniture? The Shippens, the Whartons, the Willingses. The Griscom family goes back to the original founding of the city, just as the Shippens do.
Betsy Griscom was born into a family with a long tradition in the crafts. Her great-grandfather's a house carpenter. Her father is in the carpentry trade, and other family members are dressmakers.
Very few apprentices would have had the capital to go out and begin working as an independent craftsman.
Betsy Griscom is one of 17 children, so she has to work really hard to provide for her family. The British aren't making it any easier.
By the 1760s, Britain is in financial distress from the French and Indian Wars, and they're trying to figure out how to pay for this. Protecting the colonies have gotten them into this debt, and money needs to come back out of the colonies.
To raise revenue, Parliament votes to impose a tax on all paper products sold in the colonies.
The stamp tax required that the British seal be on every piece of paper. So if you worked in upholstery like the Griscom family, you had to pay money to use the paper for your own products.
Carpenters, dressmakers, silversmiths, brickmakers, all of them have their livelihoods on the line.
The Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townsend Revenue Acts, all of these in succession anger merchants, get people talking about breaking away from British tyranny.
Betsy Griscom is drawn into street protests led by her fellow Quaker, Hannah Griffiths. Griffiths uses the power of rhetoric to rouse working-class anger.
If the sons so degenerate the blessing despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise. Hannah Griffiths, 1768.
Both Philadelphia's wealthy elite and its artisans put their faith in Ben Franklin, now the colony's chief envoy in London. But Franklin is inclined to please the British government.
He recommended a friend to be a stamp collector, thinking, well, no one likes taxes, but what are you going to do about it?
The artisans think he's one of them, and of course he is. He's a leather apron guy. In the view of other artisans, he owes them allegiance.
People were beginning to grumble that he was out of touch, which caused problems for Franklin's wife, Deborah, back home.
Angered by Franklin's betrayal, a mob heads for his house on Market Street, where Deborah Franklin waits, alone.
Deborah is in real danger. Here she is getting ready to defend the home that she and Benjamin Franklin had built.
She has no intention of going down in his bonfire.
She makes a decision to stand her ground, and she drives them away.
She wrote Benjamin a very impassioned letter saying, "You gotta get with the program. You don't understand how unhappy people really are."
When the news comes back from America of this violent reaction, Franklin has to stop for a second and say, whoa, I need to rethink my position on this issue.
This is the moment when Franklin starts to realize that he's an American and not just a member of the British Empire.
A resolute Franklin cajoles the British government into backing down. Fearing widespread rebellion, they repeal the Stamp Act. But in London and in Philadelphia, the mistrust mounts.
While Philadelphia is experimenting with revolutionary possibility, over in England, Ben Franklin happens upon eloquent, fiery Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine is known as a really fierce debater. He's gotten this reputation as someone you don't want to tangle with.
There's an immediate spark with Thomas Paine. Benjamin Franklin said, you need to go to Philadelphia.
The friction of ideas going on in Philadelphia makes it a magnet for more people to come to debate the issues that are swirling around both sides of the Atlantic.
In Boston, rampaging colonists destroy a shipment of British tea and tar and feather British customs officials.
What happens in Boston is the eruption of frustrations into acts of violence. What Philadelphia does is took that mob impulse and turned it into a set of political principles.
Three of the city's most powerful politicians concoct a plan to solidify support against English tyranny. Joseph Reed, Thomas Mifflin, and Charles Thompson must get the wealthy Quaker moderate John Dickinson off dead center. They invite him to join them at the City Tavern.
Four men put on a little play. They act out a series of arguments, continuously pushing the conversation further and further towards revolution.
They stoke the public rage with wild, staged conversations.
The middle position keeps moving to the left, and it begins to engender support from all of these working men and women.
The Reeds, the Thompsons, the leadership of the community is encouraging people to say, I could be an American. That has resonance for me.
The next day, merchants boycott British goods and artisans begin to arm themselves. In taverns and in the streets, revolt builds, beat by beat.
It was the perfect time if you had a penchant for being a rabble-rouser. Thomas Paine arrives in Philadelphia as emotions are boiling up.
He meets Benjamin Rush at Aiken's bookstore. Here he is trying to figure out the next steps of his life. He runs into a firebrand.
Rush is a real radical. He had gone to school in Edinburgh where he'd learned medical theory and practice, but it also meant he had absorbed ideas of the Enlightenment and came home hating the British Crown.
Rush and Paine form an impassioned intellectual team, daring Philadelphians to follow them.
Paine finds the ability to explain to Americans what America is going to be, and what an idiotic thing it would be to stand in the way of that future.
Like a gong sounded in the night comes Paine's Common Sense.
Printed by Robert Bell at 3rd and Walnut, Common Sense blazes out from the port across the colonies. In just 3 months, Bell sells more than 100,000 copies.
There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. Thomas Paine, 1776.
He asks the most destructive questions. What does a king have to do except make trouble and set nations at each other's throats?
We've had kings for 1,500 years. Common Sense amounts to a literary act of regicide. When people read it, they can conceive of a future now without a king.
Common Sense is walking down the street in their hands, is being waved around in the coffee houses.
Paine is speaking directly to craftspeople. You are a free man, and no one can rule over you.
No one, especially the conservative Pennsylvania government, a vestige of proprietary rule. Revolutionaries say it must go.
Philadelphians come up with the most radical interpretation of Paine's call for Republican government.
Both Paine and Franklin agree that in Pennsylvania, you're going to set down principles of democracy. The Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 is the product of artisans and laborers.
Pennsylvania is converted from being a feudal property of the Penn family. It now becomes the Commonwealth.
If you paid taxes and you were male, you could vote, including free blacks. Your voice could be heard.
Pennsylvania belongs to its people.
A sailor or furniture carver now suddenly has a way to affect politics. People around the world could not believe that Pennsylvanians were actually doing it.
It is a vision of equality. It embodies the very spirit of the American Revolution.
They didn't see the need for an executive at all. The traditional elites, they looked upon this Constitution with horror.
Now, Americans from every colony have come to Philadelphia to debate independence.
Here comes Thomas Jefferson from Virginia to join them.
Jefferson was told, go work on this. Go take some time and start drafting these ideas that we're all debating.
Jefferson rents 2 rooms in a boarding house on the outskirts of town at 7th and Market. Here, amidst fields and woods, Jefferson writes a call to arms, the Declaration of Independence. He passes off a draft to Benjamin Franklin.
In that great line that comes in the preamble, Jefferson writes, "We hold these truths to be sacred, that all men are created equal." Benjamin Franklin scratches out the word sacred and writes in self-evident.
This is the action of a consummate rationalist, the man of the Enlightenment. There couldn't be a more Philadelphia action to take.
In a city with a large population of free African Americans, it's self-evident that something is missing.
If all men are created equal, what are we doing with slavery?
How can you think about throwing off the shackles of a king if you don't then wrestle with the ideas of ending the institution of American enslavement?
Benjamin Rush pushes for a ban on the slave trade, but Southern delegates have too many votes, and Northern businessmen profit from slave labor. Jefferson removes the anti-slavery clause. Franklin and Rush agree to sign.
As the Declaration of Independence is read to this assembled crowd, and they hear this litany of charges against George III, this group of young radicals are whipped into a frenzy.
As a response to this, a mob storms into the State House. They rip down the king's coat of arms.
They couldn't get their hands on the king himself. This was the next best thing.
They drag it through the streets, ironically ending in front of the London Coffee House, and they set it on fire.
England was far and away the most powerful force on the planet. You had to be an imbecile, you had to be weird to think that this straggling bunch of colonies could win a war.
Yet, within days, thousands crowd into makeshift barracks in the Northern Liberties.
Now, upper-class families must decide which side they're going to be on.
That chasm, which starts out as a small crack, widens and becomes more and more painful to straddle, more and more dangerous to not decide.
Like a whirlwind, people who had been excluded from voting were now running the show.
Elizabeth Griscom has made her choice. She's thrown in her lot with the revolution. She's read out of her Quaker meeting, which means she's expelled. She then compounds her offense by marrying an Anglican.
She is disowned by her family, by her faith. She gave up everything.
Her husband, John Ross, gives up his life. As a soldier guarding an armory, he is mortally wounded in an explosion. The widowed Betsy Ross continues on into the war.
An army had a huge need for textiles. Betsy Ross, with her skills as a seamstress, would have been invaluable.
Sewing up the cartridge caps that hold the powder that works the guns, that's a woman's job.
We know her by the myth of making the first American flag. In reality, she made munitions. She made 60,000 musket cartridges.
While Betsy's making munitions, the son of a convicted forger, 30-year-old painter Charles Willson Peale uproots his family from Maryland.
His enterprise is larger than simply painting portraits for wealthy people who want their likenesses on the wall.
He changes that middle name to Wilson with 2 L's, as if he's put the word will into his name. That will push him into the revolution.
Peale has risen to a position of political prominence through his support of the radical Constitution of 1776.
The first day that Peale hears the militia drums parading through the street to Center Square, he says to himself, the moment has come.
Here is a man that said, it is your duty to participate in this revolution for the sake of it.
In the State House, the portrait of King George III comes down, and Peale's portrait of George Washington goes up in its place.
Peale joins the revolutionary cell called the Committee of Safety. Committee militants prowl the streets in search of wealthy, suspected Loyalists.
They are not to be trusted. America is under threat. It cannot afford to have a fifth column that is going to betray them.
You want to know if they're going to be spies. You want to know if they're going to trade with the enemy.
Mobs will sack the houses of prominent Loyalists. The property will be seized and sold off.
Peale has to bring the revolution home for them.
Night after night, they will go into the home of the Loyalists, drag them out, and exile them to Virginia.
They are forcefully taking them as if they were the kings of the city.
That's the worst kind of person that you want knocking on the door now that the shoe is on the other foot.
Now you have Philadelphia at war with itself.
Months after the Declaration of Independence, the British Army sacks and burns New York City. General George Washington brings his soldiers to Philadelphia to calm frightened residents.
Philadelphia would be a quick target. People were scrambling to prepare for the invasion that they knew was coming.
Philadelphians faced that terror. The danger of loss of life, loss of livelihood, loss of the 100 years of effort that has gone into building the city. Philadelphia could be the ruins of Troy.
British General William Howe approaches the city from the south, and at Brandywine, Washington's troops are wiped out. Howe's vast imperial army storms the city.
The English believe if you hold the capital, you hold the country.
The British Army marched down Chestnut Street just as Washington's army had marched down a month before. Loyalist Philadelphians viewed these men as liberators. Finally, order has been restored.
For the Loyalist families, the country cousins, this becomes a moment when they can schmooze with the British officers. This is certainly the case for Peggy Shippen.
Peggy Shippen was a belle of the city of Philadelphia. It wasn't a party until Peggy Shippen arrived. Why shouldn't she snag herself one of these guys and go home with him to be a duchess?
British officers squat in patriot mansions, turning Philadelphia into a conqueror's playground.
British officers are literally living in Ben Franklin's house.
Franklin has been sent to Paris to convince the French court to ally with the Americans against their shared enemy, Britain.
Washington and his army are shivering and suffering out at Valley Forge. The question in everyone's mind, is France going to come to our assistance?
With the morale of soldiers at its nadir and the noose tightening around the city, Thomas Paine gives voice to the American crisis.
These are the times that try men's souls. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered.
American soldiers who are reading this are saying, let's stand up for ourselves. This is right, and we're going to fight for this.
American passion is equaled only by British ambivalence and strategic missteps.
The Philadelphia occupation proves to be a failure from the British point of view. It doesn't precipitate surrender. It simply costs them a fortune. The command comes down to the British Army to pack up, get back on the move.
A multi-day gala will be the last hurrah for Philadelphia's richest Loyalists. Hundreds attend balls, jousting contests, and boat parades. The Mischianza culminates at the abandoned Wharton estate just south of the city.
This is a celebration in hubris.
It was a huge blowout bash to celebrate William Howe's being called back to England, where he was going to testify on why he hadn't done anything for the past 7 months.
The day after the Mischianza, undermanned American troops sneak past the depleted British at Barren Hill, back into Philadelphia.
We are still a tiny nation. Congress can barely afford to keep the army in the field. We are at the knife edge of failure.
The fate of the Continental Army lies in Benjamin Franklin's hands.
Franklin in France is a wheeling and dealing Philadelphia businessman. He's very pragmatic. He's got 20 years of experience working behind the scenes, talking about American interests.
Franklin spoke horrible French, but he was so animated and lively that people just fell in love with him.
He becomes the irresistible social prize of the season. They must have Franklin. Once he's in, they will listen to him.
What Franklin does is really, in a way, magical. He gets the French court on his side, the American side, with a hell of a lot of money.
The war takes a whole new course.
Franklin returns from France in 1785. 2 years after peace is signed, and 20 years after the Stamp Act protests had turned him into a villain. In Philadelphia, Charles Willson Peale has created a portrait gallery dedicated to the heroes of the Revolution. A lifetime of sewing leaves Betsy Ross nearly blind. Thomas Paine has left to join French revolutionaries to bring down another king. Peggy Shippen marries the traitor Benedict Arnold and will die in exile in England.
Benjamin Franklin, one of the chief architects of the Pennsylvania Constitution, wants to harness the spirit of 1776. He wants to finish the unfinished business, to abolish slavery in America.
Here's a man who owns slaves, makes his fortune advertising for runaway slaves, and at the end of his life becomes president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society.
In 1787, when the delegates arrived to write the national constitution, abolition seemed ever more distant because the wealthy class had already taken back control of the political process.
The experiment of 1776 might fall apart, and Franklin doesn't want that. Even though he's old, he decides he's going to participate in this constitutional convention and see if he can save the American experiment.
The abolition of slavery is kept out of the national constitution.
Franklin and a lot of the radicals of the period experienced the Constitution as a negation of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence.
But Franklin remains undaunted.
Philadelphia is a hotbed of black activism. Free black leaders articulate their grievances in language that the revolutionaries will understand. They want to end slavery, talk about equality.
Franklin's last public act is to write and sign a petition to Congress proposing the abolition of slavery.
Even at the end of his life, Franklin is looking forward. It turns out to be the single greatest challenge to the life of the republic he did so much to create.
The failure of Franklin's petition will set Philadelphians at war with each other for decades. But at his death in April 1790, 20,000 come together to honor Philadelphia's most essential citizen.
At the end of the day, Benjamin Franklin pushes aside all the images, honors, and symbols, the myths, the legends. Doesn't even finish his own autobiography. Instead, he describes himself as Benjamin Franklin, printer.